Anism students, and welcome to today's pre-recorded lecture on the grammar of ritual. In this lecture, I am going to guide you through the two rather challenging readings that are assigned for today. That's Catherine Bell's um, uh, book chapter on ritual reification and Ronald Grimes's book chapter on ritual as a concept. So if you have not tried to read those, I'm going to ask you to pause this, go back, and make a good faith attempt at reading those and understanding them on your own, and then come with your questions, and that way this will make more sense to you. I'm presuming that you've already done this reading, okay? So with that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and move forward and talk first about Bell, and then about Grimes, and then I'm going to go back and look at ritual in paganism, and then at the end of the video you will be ready to do the assignment that is given for today in lieu of meeting for class. So without further ado, moving right along. Bell uses the term reification to talk about what has happened to ritual in Euro-American society over the past 400 years. Let's talk a bit about that. Did anybody look the word reification up? I hope so. If you didn't, I did it for you. So here it is. The word reification means basically thingification. It involves taking an abstract concept and turning it into a concrete reality. It is acting out an abstraction. And so for Bell, she says that humans all over the world do things that could be identified potentially as ritual, but most cultures throughout the world do not actually have a term for ritual. They do not have a term that corresponds to the English word ritual. Ritual is an abstract concept invented by scholars to describe various different things that people all over the world do that may or may not be the same thing. Okay? But what happens once we have that term ritual, people start to act on it, and it actually bleeds back into the ways that humans practice. So it's a dialectical process, dialectical meaning that things affect each other and drive them forward. So, scholars and others invent the term ritual to describe a phenomenon in human existence, and that phenomenon then becomes more of a thing as a result. Let me give you a concrete example. You might have been wondering why there's a picture of Vincent van Gogh on this slide. So I use this as an example of a common phenomenon. Self-portraits have existed for a very long time. There are prehistoric archaeological examples of self-portraits of people representing themselves in material, plastic, and visual art. Van Gogh is one of the most famous practitioners of the self-portrait. In the late 19th century, he was painting pictures of himself. This is not a new thing. You know what is kind of new? Selfies. Selfies are new. The term selfie doesn't date before, I believe, 2012. That's the first time that we have that term applied. But once somebody figured out that people taking pictures of themselves on their phones and posting it to social media was a thing, we invented the term selfie to describe it. And what happened? People started taking more selfies. People took selfies of selfies. Selfie sticks were invented. An entire social ritual surrounding selfies and liking selfies and sharing selfies and panning selfies has evolved in our society around the term selfie. So to reiterate, selfie is another example of reification. There was a phenomenon in the world, self-portraiture, that has existed for a long time. Somebody invented a term for a particular form of it, and that term has become has actually driven the practice of self-portraiture since that term was invented. So in the same way, ritual has had a history like that. There was a practice of rites and ceremonies and such in human society for time immemorial, but it was relatively recently that people invented the term ritual to describe that as an abstraction and to universalize it. So you with me so far? Pause for a second. Write down some questions if you have them. Prepare to bring them to class on Friday or email me about those. I know this is complicated. Ready to move on? All right, let's do it. So next, we need to talk about how that process occurred. Bell argues, and this is not going to be news to anybody in the class, and I'm sorry to keep beating a dead horse, but the idea of ritual as an abstraction. begins with the Protestant Reformation. So when the Protestant Reformation begins, it is a rejection of the excesses and the problems perceived with Roman Catholicism. And one of those problems was the idea that the ritual of the Mass, the ritual of the Church, is what saves people, according to the Protestants, according to Luther, according to Calvin, according to the Anabaptist and the Puritans. What saves you is faith in Jesus, not the practice of the Mass. And so for the early Protestants, we see a dichotomy develop between empty ritual as something associated with Catholicism and paganism, with empty formalism, with a lack of belief, with static, dead emptiness. In contrast with Protestants who emphasize real belief, belief in Jesus, belief that does not require any ritual whatsoever. All you do is believe in Jesus and he saves you. Now, as we talked about in class, even that involves some element of ritual. But for the early Protestants, there was a clear distinction between Catholic, pagan, empty ritual and pure, full, saving Protestant belief. You with me so far? Ritual is empty, belief is full. This is the dichotomy that we're working with. But as Protestants gain power, as for instance the Protestants take over England and the British Commonwealth, outlaws Christmas because of its associations with pagan ritual, as the Puritans in America create a de-ritualized form of society, people push back. And so with the Romantic period, and again, this is not new content, but we're using it in new ways, Romanticism in many ways tries to bring back ritual. And so again, we see that work of inverting a dichotomy. You have the dominant social concept of belief over practice, of faith over ritual. Um, and so the Romantics, in many senses, invert that and say, no, we need to get back to ritual. We need to get back to experiencing nature directly through, pagan rituals, through, in this case, a Masonic initiation in the picture here. And so you get a back and forth, a dialectical flow of people either dissing ritual in favor of belief or dissing belief in favor of ritual. Add to that, by the late 19th century, the academic study of ritual by early anthropologists like Tyler, like Robertson Smith, and like James Frazer. Now, as you remember, Frazer set out to debunk ritual and religion. He wanted to show that religion is all over the world. It's always the same thing. It's always just a disguised form of the dying and rising corn god, and it's dumb. Religion is dumb. You shouldn't want to be religious because only stupid people and primitive people are religious. That's Frazer. That's not me talking. That's Frazer, okay? Let's be clear. Anyway, Frazer writes this book, The Golden Bough, to put religion down. What happens? People read it and they say, oh, this is the essence of religion. Religion is based on a ritualization of the dying and rising of the god. And so Frazer's ideas about ritual enter into the popular practice of ritual. You see what I'm saying? And so reification occurs. This abstract concept that we're studying from the outside becomes part of the practice of people on the inside. And that's the final stage, creating ritual. Pagan communities, going back to Gerald Gardner, were influenced by people like Frazer and other early anthropologists and their academic study of ritual. And so that academic construct of ritual is largely what has influenced the pagan practice of ritual. Okay, deep breath. How you doing so far? You doing okay? All right, write down any questions that you have. Be prepared to bring those, but I'm going to go ahead and move on now. I'm going to move on to talking about the Grimes reading, so make sure you've done that reading. So Grimes talks about one anthropologist in particular, Victor Turner, who was active especially in the 1960s and 1970s. And Turner is largely the source of this trifold ritual process that we were talking about in class, the idea that ritual involves three stages of separation, liminality, and incorporation. And as you recall from class, in ritual, you begin a ritual, according to Turner, you begin a ritual by delineating sacred space and time. You signal that the ritual is starting, that separation. Then what happens after that separation has been established is anybody's game. It is a crazy cloth of of social inversion and social possibility called liminality, the liminal phase, the betwixt and between phase, when, according to Turner, the basic building blocks, the ABCs of culture, are apparent and laid bare. Think about, for instance, a graduation ceremony where people walk into the graduation in their normal clothes, with their families, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then what do? Everybody puts on a robe and a hat together. They are stripped of their individual identity. They become a corporate mass. They're separated from their families and put together in a common space. And so you see not individual humans, but the idea of uneducated people becoming educated. The liminal phase effects a transformation from uneducated to educated, and then at the end, they're incorporated back into regular society after the ritual is over. So that's Turner's notion of ritual, and Grimes talks about that. And so the only point that I want you to take away from this is this. Turner's work seems to have had a profound impact on some pagan ritualization. So when we look at actual pagan ritualization, we see these three phases laid out in many different forms of modern paganism. So the separation phase, if you go back to Magliocho, open up your Magliocho if you'd like, pause the video if you want to, and go open this up to page 139, start there, and then we'll go. She talks about these three phases in many common neo-pagan rituals. And so the separation phase of ritual I've represented here by a circle and by a cross. So the circle represents the casting the circle. This is where you delineate the sacred space. You, in some form or fashion or another, determine that the community has entered into sacred space and sacred time, thereby changing how humans behave. And then the next thing is calling the quarters, calling the four directions in, centering the sacred space within the cosmos by orienting it toward the four directions and the symbolism that is attached to those four directions. Remember, each direction symbolizes a different element, symbolizes a different time of year. There are these stacks of signification involved in calling the quarters. So once the circle is cast, the quarters are called, the deities are invoked, then we enter into liminality. And liminality is where all the really interesting stuff can happen. Liminality is where transformation can occur. And so I'm not going to talk about that because that's what you're going to talk about, okay? But I want you to notice that I've represented liminality with a cone here. Go back to Magliocho and see if you can understand why a cone is what represents liminality in this, and think about the relationship between liminality and magic in pagan ritual. And then pagan ritual ends with incorporation, with the return out of sacred space back into ordinary conventional time. And this is what pagans call grounding. And it can involve actually touching the ground or touching something connected to the ground to return energy back to the earth. It also often involves cakes and wine, a ritual meal that once again regrounds people in ordinary society. So that's the end of the lecture. I would like for you now to turn to the assignment and see if you can write a couple of good paragraphs connecting pagan ritual and pagan magic based on what you've learned. Thank you for listening. I'll see you on Friday.